conservative,
Christian, mother, wife,
Air Force veteran,
gun rights advocate.
This is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
Welcome in. Thank you for being with us this evening. Stacy Washington here. Welcoming into the show as well, Daniel Corcoran, program manager at Amazon, international affairs commentator with Young Voices, host of Overcoming the Divide podcast. Daniel, thanks for the time.
Hi, Stacy. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Oh, I'm glad you're here because, first of all, you're coming to discuss why Ukraine should not be on the irreversible path into NATO. I am just like, I feel like I'm waking up into a nightmare because I'm like, why are we even talking about Ukraine and NATO? That's why there's a war going on, because people keep saying Ukraine and NATO in the same sentence.
Yes. I mean, it is quite concerning, number one, that it is deemed to be an irreversible path that NATO is going to accept Ukraine into the already immense 32-state alliance. That has obviously been a provoking factor for Russia and their international policy and their decisions for decades now. And it's quite concerning, and even more so for the American people, I would say, that it's most concerning for them because they could be, their nation's leaders could be sleepwalking us ever closer to a broader war.
And the broader war would be American boots on the ground. So our children and grandchildren, for some, being killed over a useless issue.
Yes, that would inevitably be the case. Article 5, as I talked about in an article that I recently published with Real Clear World, stated that in the treaty that Article 5 states that, in essence, the attack on one is the attack on all. So when you have a state such as Ukraine that has such deeply rooted political ties, cultural ties, historical ties, that makes the relationship between the two inherently murky. And when you're going to offer the acceptance of that state, Ukraine, into the alliance of NATO, and NATO, since its existence, directly opposed the Soviet Union, now Russia, that can easily cause for concern, to say the least. And if any kind of conflict were to break out between the two states, as it has twice now in the past decade, that would, to your point, mean U.S. troops along with other NATO allied troops on the ground. And I don't think any nation's citizens want that.
But apparently our leadership does. Like, the people that we have elected to lead the country, they appear to want to enter into a war because they keep doing things like the delivery of the F-16s. That's an escalation on our part in the support of Ukraine in a war they can't win. The only way Ukraine can win the war is if other nations rush in and engage in war with Russia, which would trigger war with China, which would trigger a world war. So if we don't want a world war, which we have no guarantee to win, then we have to acknowledge that Ukraine can't win, and they have to give up the territory that Russia's already taken. Not because I'm a Russian puppet or I love Putin. I don't. I think it's a horrible thing. But that's the situation.
Yes, I would love to illuminate this situation for some of the viewers in just terms of providing some statistics. So this war has now turned into a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, typically, the nation, the state that has the larger populace and more wealth is going to win out. And if we look at Ukraine, and if we look at Russia, Russia has roughly 4 times the population as of Ukraine, and they have a more robust economy, wartime economy, where Ukraine is completely relying on the United States and other European NATO allies to subsidize and backstop their economy. We're paying their teachers, we're paying the small business owners, and that you can make a case for that, but when there's no end in sight, and that's not a strategy, that's a death sentence. And us, by falsely saying, oh, they can win, or a leader saying they can win, they really can't. And I'll give one more stat to this as well that points in this direction. EU NATO allies pledged that they will produce anywhere from 1.4 to 1.7, 155 millimeter artillery shells by the end of 2024. That number is dubious. Outlets such as Follow the Money partnered with a number of other European organizations to go into that, whether they'd be able to fulfill that pledge. And it looks quite doubtful that they will be able to, and it's looking more likely about a third of those shells will be handed and sent over to Ukraine by the end of 2024. Now, on the other hand, Estonia intelligence predicts that Russia will have produced over 4 million of those shells by the end of 2024. These numbers don't lie, and that's why people can say different rhetoric and stick different narratives, but the numbers don't lie, and they, to your point, really conclude in a rather ominous tone, an ominous kind of decision that we'll have to make.
So just so we're clear here, help people to understand, what is the reason why Russia can make the shells so much faster than all the rest of us? Because we have manufacturing, we have factories, we have all kinds of technology here. Why can't we make the shells any faster?
Well, Russia, what they did, as any wartime country do, is they completely shifted their economy towards that goal of producing and arming their military. Makes sense. Whereas I would say that European allies of the alliance purport that they are committed to Ukraine's success, but it doesn't seem to be that way. And when it comes to also the politics within the United States and also the politics within different countries, there is now pushback among different, say, countries such as the United States, but also Germany and elsewhere, that should we really be supporting this war? So you have that on one hand, and then you have Russia on the entire other hand, completely orientate their economy to support this war, to fund this war. And back to the original point, Ukraine has none of these manufacturers, at least in operation that I'm aware of, that are producing shells or resources to this extent at all. And they're really reliant on their European and NATO allies.
So basically, we haven't ramped up production because we don't really want to. We're just going to keep providing a few bullets at a time. And Russia's making, just however many they feel like they need to, because their aim here, and they've stated it many times before, is to keep NATO missile batteries off of the edge of their country. So as long as they need to, as long as it takes, they're in this thing.
Yes, and I believe this is even more concerning to the United States as well, because I believe it was one House committee found and made public that a report that gives a state of address on the military readiness of the United States found that the United States military is dramatically underprepared and vulnerable now more than ever, I believe, in quite some time in terms of taking on a foreign threat and a foreign state, God forbid. So this all points to quite disastrous resolutions or outcomes, But the point being here is that Russia will win a war of attrition, and I don't like that. I don't think most people like that. But that's the reality of the situation. And at this point, I think coming to a resolution of peace is the best way to conclude this ongoing war. And it's a tragedy. And I'll provide one historical anecdote to this as well. During the Korean War, between 1950 and 1951, the lines fluctuated quite a bit. But after 1951, I believe, after June of 1951, the lines remained rather steady. But what continued to happen was the conveyor belt of onslaught and death. And I think at this point, that's what we need to be prioritizing and focusing our efforts on.
So let's talk about what it would look like, because this is a conversation that I think some people don't want to hear, but this is where we are. If let's say we fast forward, because we do in our minds, we do this. We think if January 2nd were tomorrow, and then you start thinking through what you would do. And so that's what I want to do here. Let's say it's, February 1st of 2025, and it's a Trump presidency, and he's sitting down with Zelensky and Putin and whoever else is going to come into the room, but they don't matter. and they're discussing how the war can end. What do you see the agreement in that would come? What kind of agreement would come out of that conversation?
I think I can't speak to what way that Ukraine would need to concede or not concede. However, I know one of the staple pieces of that agreement would be Ukraine not joining NATO. And I think for most average Americans, most people who look at this level-headedly will look at that and be like, okay, what's the big deal? NATO was created as a defensive pact, but really has been rather, I wouldn't say antagonistic to Russia in previous years in just regards to expanding its borders and expanding into the Baltic states. Now it has dramatically expanded its border with Russia with the induction of Finland in the NATO. So I think with all that given, not allowing Ukraine into NATO is something that would be a staple piece of that agreement, and having that be a main part of it isn't such a bad thing. I don't think really hurts the United States in any way.
It doesn't hurt anyone, actually, because Ukraine's not in NATO now, and they're getting all this support from us. So honestly, there is no harm in leaving them out of NATO. I sincerely believe that.
And to play, I guess, devil's advocate, if I was a Ukrainian citizen, I would most likely want that security umbrella, for sure. I mean, I understand that argument, but that's where it comes down to doing what's best for your own national interest. And that's why I don't blame Zelensky for wanting to get all of the aid that he can get from the United States. His country's at war. But that doesn't mean our interests, such as the United States, and his interests always converge. And at times, I think they're in direct polar opposites.
What's in our best interest is if our military isn't ready for war, is for us to immediately stop funding and supporting a war in Ukraine so that we can build ourselves up and become ready for war if we need to be.
Yes, I think the misallocation of resources and lack of strategic foresight has been quite dire. And that's why I point people to Elbridge Colby, who worked in the Trump administration and developed the defense strategy for them. And he's put out a book not too long ago that goes into where our priorities should be, which lie in Asia, which rely in building a coalition to counter Chinese hegemony, dominance in the region. And that is where I believe our priorities should be as well, and not in eastern Ukraine and quibbling over the Donbass region, even though I understand the gravity it is for people who try to understand how serious that could be for people who live there, and that's a war-torn country now. But for the United States, we need to put our interests first, to say the least.
Yep. I think your article at Real Clear World is so clear. You talk about what happens if Donald Trump wins this November with Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, and that Ukraine's hopes of joining NATO would vanish, but that wouldn't be a bad outcome. I highly recommend the article. It's linked in the show notes over at stacyontheright.com. Daniel Corcoran, thank you so much for coming on the show. And the podcast that you host is Overcoming the Divide, available wherever podcasts are played, but you can go to podcasts at Apple Podcasts, and take a listen. And also Young Voices, which we love, all of the Young Voices contributors, joinyv.org. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, Stacy. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you. Have a great evening.